Okay, well, welcome to Getting to Know the 2020 Household Impact Study. My name is Rick Knight, and I am the research coordinator working for Danny Richter in the research department. And I'm going to go through this presentation to let you know what we found about the impact of carbon fee and dividends, specifically the Energy Innovation Act, on households. So hopefully you can see my slides, and I will now go ahead and begin. I'd also like to mention that there's a Q&A feature in your Zoom screen, so you can log in your questions that will be answered after the talk. All right, so.
Hey, Rick. Oh, never mind. We're seeing your slides now. Great.
Okay, yeah, here we go. Here are my goals for this presentation. First, to make sure that you all understand just what a household impact study is and why CCL has made it a research priority. Next, to learn why 100% carbon dividends are good for people. And finally, to learn how best to use this information in your advocacy for climate action. So what does this kind of study tell us? We know that the Energy Innovation Act levies a carbon fee on coal, oil, and gas, which is paid into a carbon dividend trust fund. Naturally, the buyers of those fuels, utilities, the refiners, and all kinds of manufacturers will be charged more for those fuels. And they'll pass along at least part of those costs on to their customers, who are American households buying electricity, gasoline, heat for their home, and a multitude of other products and services that are made with some amount of energy. So then, under this policy, the cycle is closed by paying carbon dividends to households. That poses the question, how does this work out for people? And that's what this study aims to answer. Now, this was first addressed in 2015 when we hired an expert consultant to carry out this kind of analysis. So let's look at how it was done. The study methods and calculations dealt with two main elements: the carbon cost to U.S. households from the fee, how much of that extra fuel cost they end up paying. The study consulted state and federal data on the carbon intensity of energy, mainly electricity, right down to the zip code level. It used federal data to relate household income and household consumption to their carbon footprint. It also considered how much of the costs imposed by the carbon fee and passed through from businesses to consumers. And I'll come back to this later because it's particularly important to get right. Finally, the study made corrections to account for both under and over reporting of income and expenditures, which are well documented in collecting data that depends on what people claim in their finances and consumer behavior. The other element is the carbon dividend payments to U.S. households, which offset those increased energy costs. The study used the fee and dividend payment formula of equal dividends per person, with children under 19 getting a half share. And I'll talk more about how that changed after the bill was introduced. And finally, the income tax burden, which was factored into the net results because in the Energy Innovation Act, the dividend is treated as taxable income. So now the project history. In 2016, the first iteration of this study was completed. This was before any bill was introduced, so it was based on the carbon fee and dividend proposal by CCL, which was somewhat different in certain details from the current bill. Anyway, the study was commissioned to answer questions about whether carbon dividends will cover year one energy costs. It was conducted by a data analyst, Kevin Ummel, who was then with the International Institute for Applied Analysis. He's now with the University of Pennsylvania. So Mr. Ummel issued a working paper plus state and district level summaries that we were able to use in lobby meetings and meetings with potential supporters. But since then, not only has a bill been introduced, and a lot of other things have changed as well, so that in late 2019, we commissioned and updated the study to account for the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act that Ted Deutsch introduced, and also policy changes reflecting the HR 763 bill introduction, as well as fresh data on emissions, tax law, economics, and demographics, as well as new research that could affect the results. So here's a summary of how those versions differ. First of all, in 2016, as I said, the study was based on CCL's carbon fee and dividend proposal. The 2020 study, which was just finished at the beginning of July, is based on the actual legislation, which differs in some important ways. The old study assumed 100% pass-through of costs from the fossil fuel producers all the way down to consumers. But the new study considered new research showing that pass-through is not likely to be 100%, but could be as low as 70% overall, and much lower for some economic sectors. So this study initially analyzed 70 and 100% pass-through cases. And after further consultation with the author, we agreed on a base case of 85% pass-through. Now, the 2016 study presented how the results broke down across the wealth spectrum in terms of household income, as reported to the IRS. But for the new study, Mr. Ummel showed that the household economic status is more accurately based on consumption rather than income. The reason is that certain consumers actually have more disposable wealth, such as tax-free investment income, than the amount that shows up in their tax records, and so consumption gives a more accurate picture of their economic status. Finally, the 2016 paper was based on emissions and economic data from the period 2008 to 2012, but on the other hand, the new 2020 study used the most recent available emissions and economic data, which is from 2017 to 2019. So those were put into the results from the 2020 study. And now I'm going to dig into those results. Let me turn on my laser pointer. I'll start with the economic status breakdown, which arranges household into quintiles, each of which is 1/5 of the population, ranked by consumption. It's just a fancy word for household spending on goods and services. First, direct energy costs are affected by the carbon fee. That means gasoline, electricity, and whatever fuel people use for heating and cooking. Now, this is the amount that the average household would see as a pass-through from carbon fee in the first year of the policy. So for context, the household income for an average size household in quintile 1 is about $30,000. In quintile 2, it's about 52,000. In quintile 3, 70,000. In quintile 4, 93,000. And in the top quintile, 159,000. Now next, here's the indirect energy costs. That means all the other products we buy that use energy in their manufacture. This is how much average households will pay in additional costs for all that stuff. And finally, financial asset costs. This represents that 15% of carbon fee costs that were assumed by businesses rather than passed down in their prices. And it hits the fossil energy investments that are buried in people's stock portfolios or bank accounts. As you can see, the wealthier households have a lot more of those investments and tend to be far more affected by this portion of the pass-through, or the pass-back, I should say. So those are the costs. And these numbers, okay, so these numbers at the top, those are the totals of that stacked up cost. And you can see for each quintile how they differ. Now, Here are the dividends you get back. You can see how this plays out. Households in the bottom 20% do very well, get a lot more dividends than they incur costs. The second and third quintile also come out ahead, and even the fourth quintile just about breaks even. It's those big energy users at the top who, for the most part, end up behind. But here's an important point about that. Compared to total income, this gap only amounts to less than 0.5% of their income. In most cases, not even 0.25%. So it's not as punitive as it might look. And also consider there's nothing to stop a wealthy family from cutting their costs by investing in solar panels or electric vehicles, or by even divesting their portfolios from fossil fuels. So what percent of households come out ahead in each quintile? I'm glad you asked, because this slide shows it. Overall, 61% of households come out ahead. You can see that here. And another 24% experience only a minor loss, which means less than 0.2% of their income. In the bottom quintile, families with the least means to weather any economic burden, 96% come out ahead, and only 2% have even a minor loss. Even at the top, as I said before, more than half experience either a gain or an insignificant loss compared to their income. And there are plenty of ways for an individual to turn a loss into a gain, given the clean energy opportunities that will emerge under this policy. Another way that Kevin Ummel presented these results was a breakdown by age. It shows that gains are concentrated in the youngest and oldest households, and that reflects the fact that the youngest households tend to be larger, and including kids and early in their earnings growth. The oldest households, on the other hand, tend to experience reduced mobility and lower consumption due to fixed retirement incomes. And of course, middle age is where careers are in their prime and consumption is highest, but a majority still come out ahead. Here's another chart that addresses a common misconception among critics of carbon pricing, that rural households will be hard hit because they have to drive longer distances. In reality, there's very little difference between rural, suburban, and urban communities as far as how they do with dividends versus costs. Longer travel distances in rural areas are offset by other factors, such as lower energy and commodity prices, generally lower cost of living. Of course, district level results depend on community composition. So, for example, a purely urban district may show big differences between these area types because so few residents fit into these other categories. Here's how the results break down according to race or ethnicity, using standard federal census categories: Asian, Black, Latino, multiracial, other, and white. As you can see, people of color benefit in larger proportions than white households, and these effects are due to the generally lower economic status and larger, younger families among non-white households. These outcomes are inherent in the policy design, with no need for complicated, costly means testing or targeting benefits in ways that could be highly contentious politically. It shows the simplicity of the policy and how it results in very progressive and very socially just outcomes. And the last of the green bar charts I'll show you focuses on various kinds of households that are of interest to certain legislators or groups because they're considered most vulnerable to economic burdens. This looks at families below the poverty line, lower income, which means twice the federal poverty line, minorities as a whole, families of four, older adults, and single parent households. The results show that a majority of people in groups flagged as most vulnerable have a net gain. Families in poverty and low income are most benefited. Only older adults, which means households with no children, where at least one member of the household is over 65, fail to show gains in more than 70% of households. And that's because there's a significant fraction of older adults who actually are quite well off. But even then, a majority still come out ahead. So here's the bottom line. A plan like the Energy Innovation Act, a carbon fee with 100% dividends, is good for people. It is beneficial to the most vulnerable among us. It does not put the burden for solving climate change on the poor. Anyone who says it does is wrong. And we have done the hard work to prove it. So now you may be wondering where you can find all this information and how to make use of it. I'm so glad you asked because we've made it all available to you, starting with our public website, citizensclimatelobby.org. If you go to the home page and click on our climate solution, you'll see price on pollution studies, third item down on this list. And if you go down and click on that, you'll see this page. And if you scroll down, you'll see this entry at the bottom, the third one from the top, saying 2020 Household Impact Study. You click that, and it takes you to this page, titled appropriately 2020 Household Impact Study. And if you start scrolling down, you'll see all the basic information about the study, along with the charts I just went through. And then if you keep scrolling down, down, one more. Okay, here's a screen with 3 useful documents you can download. First is a 2-page summary of the study, which can be a handout or a leave behind for lobby meetings or with prospective endorsers. Next, you can access the full study by Kevin Ummel if you want to reference to that or to go through it and see how it was performed. And there is also a PDF copy of an FAQ, a frequently asked questions document, which is also here at the bottom of this web page. So that's what's available on the CCL public website. Now, there are also some other related resources on CCL Community and on the Energy Innovation website. Probably most important is a collection of 2-page handouts for every state and every congressional district. These are PDFs that show some of the household benefit charts specifically for that particular jurisdiction, state or district. You can get to them in CCL Community by finding Resources and Training, then All Resources, then scroll down to Studies and Reports, and then find the link to the Household Impact Study. That page will have links to Google Drives where you can find those handouts. There's also a person carbon dividend calculator located on the Energy Innovation Act website that's been updated to be in complete agreement with the findings of the 2020 study. And I'll show you those. Here's the web page on Community where you can find all those state and district handouts. And like I said, you go to Resources and Training, click All Resources, then scroll down to Studies and Reports, and there you can find this page. And if you scroll down, you'll see this page where here are the state reports and here are the district reports. Again, clicking on one of these links will take you to a Google Drive where you can find those handouts that you want to download. For the calculator, here's the Energy Innovation Act.org homepage. You click on how it works up here, takes you to this page, and here in the upper right corner is the link to the personal carbon dividend calculator. You click that, and you're in the interactive tool. I'm not going to go through this because of time constraint, but just wanted you to know that it's been updated so it corresponds to those household impact study data for 2020. So the next question, the final question, how does this strengthen our advocacy and help us move the ball forward, I should say? It does that by providing proof that the policy we've thrown all our weight behind really is good for people. Climate impacts and even pollution impacts, which, by the way, Jerry Hinkle will talk about in the seminar tomorrow. It protects poor and vulnerable households from having to bear an undue burden while we set the gears in motion to transform our energy systems. It gives you access to detailed demographic analysis when that information is needed by legislators, by potential endorsers, or by anyone who wants it. And finally, it explains the reasons for our confidence that this policy is both fair and progressive from a purely financial standpoint. It's not just assertions at play here, but here's the evidence to back them up. So that's where I'll say thanks and see if we have time for a few questions that were posted in the Q&A feature during this talk. Thank you.
Hi, Rick. Yeah, we do have a few questions, some very good ones. One person wanted to know if you had any information on economic effects during later years, presumably after the study's finished.
Yeah, we tried to get Kevin Hummel to get into that, but he felt that from a modeling standpoint, there are just too many uncertainties to really look forward. We didn't, to not only look at how emissions will change, but how energy prices will change as different renewables and other decarbonization methods come online, not knowing what changes in tax policy might come along. So we couldn't convince him that it was really would really give valuable or valid results to try to go ahead.
Okay, great. There were also a few people who wanted to know how the percentages of people who are not within the bars, how are they going to fare? How the people who suffer
Right.
more than just a minor loss, how much of a loss is that?
Yeah, that's of course a wonderful question. It will not be generally more than 1% and probably less than 0.5% in most cases. And I would point out that people have asked this question about the lowest income quintile. And I asked Kevin Hummel, well, how do you really explain that there are still a few percent of people that don't come out ahead? He said one example could be students who are being supported by their families, by their parents, but living on campus and have very low income, but they really don't have suffer the vulnerabilities of a low income household. So there are probably people who fall into strange categories like that. But generally speaking, 0.5% would be the largest that anybody would, shortfall that anybody would suffer.
Okay, great. Another person wanted to know if the household impact study takes the pandemic into account.
No, it doesn't take it into account. It was actually started in, I believe, November of 2019 and was completed really in April when things were just kicking in. So, yeah, it doesn't take that into account.
Okay, and interestingly, this question is what percentage of the revenue, if you know it, what percentage of the revenue could be used for other purposes besides a dividend and still allow for the lowest 40% of the population to benefit?
That's a question we haven't looked into. It would really be a very interesting thing to do. And we may be able to calculate that from the data we have in Kevin Hummel's spreadsheets. And I'm going to take note of that. That could be, and that may become really important next year when the sausage making begins. So it's a great question and very helpful.
Okay, great. One participant wanted to know whether economic studies in general tend to be accurate in their predictions. In other words, how can we know that we can trust what this is saying?
Hmm. Yeah, well, is a certain amount of random error in any economic predictions, not only because they have to kind of forecast what is going to happen in the future, but just from the error bars in the data in general. And I think you'll see it if you went to the carbon dividend calculator, we do show a range of outcomes for a specific household. If you put those numbers in, I think on a monthly basis, the error range is about plus or minus $17. So let's say you went to that calculator and you found that your household looked like it was going to come out ahead by $10. Depending on your particular energy habits and behavior, it could be anywhere from plus or minus $17. So $10 could be, you could lose $7 if you're a big energy user. You could gain much more if you're very frugal with your energy. So it's about plus or minus that.
Okay, great. And there's a very quick one, and so I'll give you two at once. The first one is what's the percentage considered for the administrative costs? And then the second question would be, how is consumption by household calculated in this study?
Okay, for the first question, we've actually done a pretty deep dive into that. It's pretty much a fixed amount every year, so it doesn't go up as the fee increases and the revenue increases. But so it comes to about 6% of revenue in year one, but it very quickly drops as the revenue increases to less than 2%. I think over the life of the policy, it's something like 2.2%. But it's taken into account in this analysis about 6% in that first year, the administrative cost. Now, as for the second question, which I've forgotten already, can you repeat it?
Sorry about that.
Tammy?
It was how did they calculate the consumption by
Yeah.
household?
Okay, there actually is a federal database on household consumption that was consulted for this. And I don't know what it is, but it's spelled out in the paper, in the full paper. I think we have 2 more minutes.
Yeah, I'm looking for more questions. There's so many good ones. It's hard
Yeah.
to sort through. One person is asking why we separated quintiles by consumption rather than income.
Yeah, I think I tried to explain that because income, Kevin Hummel made a good point of this, is not really an accurate representation of a family's financial status, because there are some households that have a lot of wealth, but they show up as low income in federal records. So the consumption, assuming that we spend what we earn, that if people are consuming more than their income is showing, obviously they're getting income from some other source, like they could be drawing on retirement trust fund or something like that. So it was done that way in order to give a more accurate representation of household financial status.
Great. And there were several questions about the pass-through. This may be our last question, but
Yeah.
what prevents the energy companies from passing the full amount through to households, or why is that number not 100%, and what
Yeah.
constitutes that number?
Yeah, that's of course a wonderful question. And tomorrow in the webinar, in the seminar, I'm going to go into that in a little more detail. But there have been several studies showing that businesses do sometimes absorb the costs of new taxes, and partly that's because of competitive pressure from their competition. And so we don't know. There's nothing that stops companies from passing that along if they want to. So this is more or less looking into the crystal ball and trying to anticipate what people are going to do. I think we
Great.
are out of time. Yeah.
Yeah, we're at time. The questions are marvelous. In the chat, everybody, you can see links for other resources where you can get your questions answered.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.